My name is John. I'm 64 years old. For the last 4 decades, I've been a maintenance technician at the same company. Most people wouldn't see the appeal in a job like mine. It's not glamorous. It's not about board meetings or big decisions. I wasn't ever in the spotlight, but I didn't mind. I was good at what I did, and that was enough for me. My hands were always busy, fixing, adjusting, maintaining, making sure the machines worked, the equipment ran, and everything stayed in motion. Every morning, without fail, I was up at 5 o'clock. It's just the way it's always been. I had this unspoken rhythm. Breakfast, a strong coffee, a quick glance at the news, and then out the door by 6 o'clock. By 6:30, I was in the building, checking the heating system, ensuring the machines were in order, making sure the office floors were clean. The lights flickered no more than they should. The work might have been repetitive, but it was predictable. And predictability was comfort. For years, people noticed my consistency. Even the new hires. They'd look at me, the guy who'd been there since the beginning of time, practically. And after a while, it became a joke. People started saying, well, John's the rock around here, the one we can always count on. I never needed much more than that. The last year at the company, everyone knew that my time was coming. It wasn't a big deal. At least that's what I thought. I'd put in my time. I'd worked hard, never called in sick, never slacked off. It felt like a natural progression. Retirement was on the horizon. The office even threw me a little party last month. Some cake, some handshakes, some hollow congratulations. But I didn't mind. They said they'd miss me, that they hoped I'd enjoy my golden years. What did I have to complain about? I'd made peace with it all. I was ready. But then, on a Monday morning, I got a call. It wasn't a phone call from my manager. That would have been too simple. No, it was a message to come into the office early. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe they needed me to fix something or sign off on paperwork. I put on my boots, grabbed my tool belt, and headed in as usual. I didn't think that day would be any different from the others. But it was. When I walked into that office, the manager, a man I'd worked under for the past decade, was sitting at his desk, looking at the papers in front of him like they were more important than me. He glanced up briefly and then went back to his work. John, he said, not bothering to stand. Sit down. I did, though it felt strange. He wasn't usually like this. Usually there was some pleasantry, a few words about the weather or the weekend. Not today. We're updating the team, he said finally, and for a moment, I didn't quite understand him. You've been a great asset to this company, but it's time to move on. A silence filled the space between us, thick with unspoken things. He wasn't looking at me now, just staring at the paper in front of him, like I wasn't there. He pushed a box in my direction, a cardboard box, the kind that holds personal items. The box looked so ordinary, so mundane. But when I looked inside, I saw a mug. My mug. It had my name on it in block letters, and a folder labeled, "Thank you for your service." It felt like a joke, but there was no humor in it. I didn't say anything at first. I didn't need to. The air in that office had thickened. I could feel the subtle weight of the decision, the dismissal pressing down on me. I could feel the anger creeping up my chest, but I didn't give in to it. Not then. I was always the one who kept calm, kept composed. I picked up the box. I didn't look at him again. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I stood up, turned, and walked out the door. The familiar hum of the machines, the quiet buzz of the building I'd called home for 4 decades, felt oddly empty as I stepped through the exit. It wasn't the same place anymore. I wasn't the same person. And as I walked down the hallway, past the open doors to the departments where I'd worked all those years, I couldn't help but feel that something had been stolen from me. Not just the job, not just the paycheck, but something deeper, something intangible. Respect, maybe. Recognition. I stepped out into the cold, into the void, carrying my box. The world seemed louder now, less predictable. But I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. It wasn't just the box that I carried out that day. It was everything I'd built over the years. A lifetime of effort, of working weekends, of being on call when others were home with their families. It wasn't just the mug, the folder, or the silence in the office. It was the realization that all those years had amounted to this. I stood outside for a moment, not knowing where to go. The cold air stung my face. the weight of the box heavy in my hands. I looked around at the parking lot, the same parking lot I'd parked in every morning for the past 40 years. The same parking lot where I had started my career, just a kid looking for a job. That was my life right there, in that parking lot, in that building, in the tools I carried. But none of it mattered now. I got into my truck, the box beside me on the passenger seat. The familiar sound of the engine starting up felt strangely distant. The hum of the engine had always been a comforting sound, but now it was just noise. I felt numb, but deep down, a fire started to burn. Maybe it wasn't rage. Maybe it was something quieter, something more dangerous. It was the feeling that I'd been wronged, that I had been discarded like some outdated part that was no longer useful. I drove home without really thinking about the route. The same roads, the same houses, the same familiar streets, but everything felt different. Even the trees on the side of the road, the ones I'd seen 1,000 times, looked foreign now. I passed by them as if for the first time, and I realized they were no longer part of my world. When I got home, I could tell by the look on my wife's face that she already knew. She didn't need to ask what had happened. We'd been through enough to know what that look meant. "You gave them everything," she said softly when I walked in. "And they gave you what?" Her words hung in the air like a weight. It wasn't anger in her voice, though. It was a quiet sorrow. She understood. She'd seen how hard I'd worked, how many hours I'd spent away from home, how many days I'd missed our kids' events, their milestones. I'd done it for us. I'd done it for our future. Now it felt like all that sacrifice was just nothing. I set the box down on the kitchen table. "Severance pay," I muttered, my voice sounding strange even to me. It felt foreign to say, to admit that they had thrown me a few crumbs and called it thank you. My hands clenched into fists, the bitterness bubbling up. She didn't respond immediately. She just nodded and then looked away. Her gaze turned toward the window like she was searching for something outside, something beyond the walls of this house. But there was nothing out there. I sat down at the kitchen table, my eyes fixated on the folder that had been shoved into the box. It was thick with papers, no doubt the official paperwork that they thought would make everything okay. No apology, no recognition of the years I had given them. Just the cold transaction of numbers, the calculation of my worth. I didn't want to open it, but I did anyway. Inside was a neatly typed letter, thanking me for my service. A polite little note that meant nothing. And under that, the details of my severance package. A small amount of money, enough to cover a couple of months of bills, but not much more than that. Not enough to live on for long. I exhaled slowly, reading the numbers, then pushing the paper away. There was no emotion in me now, just a quiet clarity. I had no illusions left, no more hopes that the company would care, that they would recognize the years I had dedicated to them. "I'll be fine," I said quietly, though I wasn't sure I believed it. I stood up, my mind already shifting to something else. I needed a plan. I had a family to support, a life to live. A pension wouldn't be enough, not by a long shot. I pulled out a calculator from the drawer, a tool I hadn't used in years. It had been gathering dust, forgotten in the corner of a drawer filled with receipts and old papers. But now it felt like the only thing that mattered. I started typing the numbers in, adding up the bills, subtracting the little severance pay, then adjusting for the mortgage, the utility payments, insurance. It wasn't pretty. The numbers didn't lie. I was staring at a shortfall, a big one. The pension wasn't enough, and the insurance was gone. I could see it all now. The coming months, the tightening grip of reality. But I wasn't the type to give up. I never had been. I sat there for hours calculating, recalculating, running the numbers over and over again. And then, slowly, a thought began to form in my mind. They dismissed me. They thought they could get rid of me without a second thought. But what if I had something else? What if there was another way? I'd been in that building for 40 years. I knew it better than anyone. I knew the people. I knew the systems. I knew what was happening behind closed doors. And the company? The company had its own struggles. It wasn't as secure as it thought. There were cracks in the foundation. I'd spent years fixing things. Maybe it was time to fix something bigger. I spent the next few days in a haze. The mornings felt like they were dragging on endlessly, every minute stretching out in front of me like a desert. The world outside had continued to turn, but I felt frozen in time, stuck between what had been and what was yet to come. I couldn't shake the image of the office. The sterile walls, the empty desk where my tools had once sat, the folder that didn't mean anything. It all kept replaying in my mind. I didn't talk much to anyone about it. My wife tried to comfort me, but even she knew there was no fixing what had happened. It was just a part of life now, but I couldn't accept it. I wasn't the kind of man who could just sit back and let things happen to him. The first few days after being let go, I tried to figure out what my options were. The reality hit hard when I opened up the mail and saw the pension statement. It was barely enough to cover half of what I'd need each month. At my age, finding another job wasn't an option, especially with the health insurance issue. I'd have to pay for it out of pocket. That added even more weight to the pile of uncertainty. It wasn't that I was afraid of hard work. I never had been. It was that I wasn't sure where to direct my energy anymore. For years, I'd worked at that company day in and day out, believing in stability. I thought that after all these years of loyalty, I'd be able to retire in peace. Instead, I found myself left with nothing. No company pension to rely on, no retirement savings worth mentioning, and it seemed no respect from the people I had helped build that place. I spent some time trying to find work, just enough to cover the gap. I contacted a few former colleagues, made some calls, but everyone seemed too busy with their own lives, their own problems. The market had changed. Companies were laying off people left and right. Who would hire a 64-year-old guy with no formal qualifications beyond a maintenance job? But as I sat at home, something changed in me. The pity, the helplessness, the resignation. It started to fade. Slowly, a clearer thought began to form. I remembered all the years I'd spent walking those hallways, working alongside people who thought they were untouchable, climbing the corporate ladder, building a reputation. I had never been part of the big decisions, but I had always been the one who kept the place running smoothly. That was when it hit me. I knew the building. I knew the business. I knew exactly how things operated behind the scenes. What if there was a way to turn the tables? It wasn't like me to act impulsively. I was always the guy who measured everything, who counted every inch, every step. But now I realized I'd been playing their game all along, in their world, on their terms. What if it was time for me to change the rules? I needed to know more. More about the building, more about the company's finances, more about the people who owned it. So I started asking questions. I contacted a few former colleagues, people who'd been in the loop but had left over the years. One of them, Tom, had worked in real estate and always had a good sense of what was happening with the company's assets. Tom was surprised to hear from me, but when I told him what had happened, he listened quietly. "John, I'm sorry to hear that," he said. "You deserve better. But if you're looking for something else to get your hands on, you might want to know that the building is being rented out right now. The owner wants to sell." I paused for a moment, taking in the words. "Sell?" I asked. "Yeah. They've been talking about it for a while now. The building's getting older, and they've been getting offers. I don't know if they've made a final decision, but it's definitely on the market." I felt a small spark inside me. The pieces started falling into place. I had nothing left to lose, and if there was an opportunity, I wasn't going to let it slip away. "Thanks, Tom," I said, my voice a little sharper now. "I'll look into it." The next day, I took a drive to the building, parking in the lot where I had spent so many early mornings, fixing broken doors and cleaning air filters. I sat in my truck for a while, just staring at the place. It hadn't changed much. Still the same gray exterior, still the same corporate buzz inside. But I saw it differently now. It wasn't just a building, it was an opportunity. I didn't waste any time. I started looking for information. I searched through public records, contacted real estate agents, found out who was handling the sale. What I learned made my stomach tighten. The building was worth more than I'd expected. The tenants, the lease agreements, the equipment inside, all of it was part of the deal. I didn't have the kind of money to buy it outright, but I knew I had something else. Leverage. I could take out a loan, mortgage the cottage, find a partner. I wasn't going to buy it on my own, but I could get close. Close enough to make it work. I wasn't a fool. I knew how to make deals. I'd spent my whole life fixing things. Now it was time to fix something bigger. I spent the next few days working out the details, pulling together everything I could. I reached out to a former colleague who had some business acumen, a man who knew the ins and outs of investments. I told him what I was planning, and after some back and forth, he agreed to partner up with me. It was a risk, but what wasn't at this point? 3 months. That was the timeline I gave myself. 3 months to figure out the deal. 2 days after that, I would have the documents in my hands. And then I would have the chance to turn this whole thing around. They thought they'd won. They thought I was out of the game. But what they didn't know was that I had a plan, and it was about to change everything. 3 months. That was the time I gave myself. It seemed like a short window, but it was just enough for me to put the pieces together. I spent the days scouring every document I could find, studying every detail, asking the right questions, and doing the kind of research that would take most people years to accumulate. I mortgaged the cottage. It wasn't something I did lightly, but there was no other way. I knew I had one shot at this. If I failed, I'd have nothing left. But if I succeeded, I'd be in control. I found a partner, a man named Mark, who had the resources and the know-how to back the deal. He wasn't a close friend, but we had enough history in the business world to know that we could get this done. He was younger, sharper in some ways, but I had the experience he lacked. Together, we had a chance. Mark was skeptical at first, but I convinced him. We spoke about the building, the tenants, the current market conditions, everything. We didn't rush, but we were efficient. I wasn't in a position to waste time, not with so much on the line. Over the next few weeks, we drew up the necessary paperwork and made the financial arrangements. There were risks, of course. No business deal is without them. But this felt different. It wasn't just about business. It was about proving something, about making sure that my story didn't end with an office folder and a thank you for your service mug. The final hurdle was finding the right lawyer. I wasn't about to trust anyone with this deal, not after what had happened. I wanted someone I could rely on, someone who understood the intricacies of business law and could navigate the legal complexities with precision. I went through 3 different lawyers before I found the one I trusted. A woman named Carol, sharp as a tack, with a reputation for handling deals with finesse. She was just as meticulous as I was. That was the kind of person I needed on my side. The agreement took shape. The company's owner had been going back and forth with potential buyers, but he had never moved forward with anything concrete. The building had sat on the market for months, and no one seemed willing to take the final step. When I first approached Carol with the idea, she was hesitant, but after we discussed the financials and the details of the deal, she saw what I saw. It made sense. We could afford it, and we had the leverage to make it work. It wasn't a matter of taking advantage. It was about opportunity. I'll admit, the first time I signed those papers, I felt a moment of doubt. The weight of what I was about to do hung over me like a cloud. I was about to invest everything into something that might fall apart. But then I remembered the manager's face when he handed me that folder. I thought about my life, about all the years I had spent working for that company. It wasn't just a building I was buying. It was my dignity, my future, my last chance to control something. The day came when everything was finalized. Mark and I had sealed the deal. The building was ours. I felt a sense of calm wash over me. It wasn't joy, it wasn't triumph. It was something more subtle, more calculated. I had made my move. Now I had to wait. I gave myself a few days to catch my breath, to let the enormity of what I'd done settle. Then I began preparing for the next phase. I needed to go back to that place, the place where they had humiliated me, the place where I had spent so many years of my life. I wasn't going back as an employee. I was going back as the owner. I thought about what I would say when I walked into that building. I imagined the look on the faces of the people who had once been my colleagues. I didn't need to make a grand speech or shout my victory from the rooftops. I didn't need to show them that I'd won. I just needed to walk in with the same calm certainty I'd carried all along. I could already picture it in my mind. The moment I would hand over the new lease agreement, the moment the senior manager would realize exactly who I was. The thought made me smile. I wasn't angry anymore. There was no need for that. Anger wasn't going to fix anything. But this was something different. This was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I had played my cards exactly right. And soon enough, it would be time to collect. The day arrived. I drove to the building, the same route I had taken countless times during my years working there. As I approached, I felt nothing. Not anxiety, not triumph. Just a steady resolve. The place looked the same. The old gray facade, the large glass doors that led into the cold corporate lobby. It was almost surreal to think that, only a few months ago, I had been walking through those doors, going about my daily routine like any other technician. Now I was driving up to the place as the owner. I parked in the lot, taking a moment to gather myself before stepping out of the truck. It felt different now, like the world was giving me a little space to breathe. I could already picture the looks on their faces. The colleagues, the managers, the ones who had looked past me for so many years. I had been the silent worker in the background, fixing things, making sure everything ran smoothly, all the while knowing that I would never be the one to sit in a plush office or make a decision that mattered. Now I was the one in control. I walked toward the building, the door swishing open automatically as I approached. It felt strange to be entering the building without the usual uniform. No tool belt, no grease-stained shirt. Today I was dressed in a dark suit, a sharp contrast to the worn work clothes that used to define me. Inside, the usual buzz of office workers filled the space. I could see the senior manager, Dave, the same man who had handed me my dismissal notice just a few months ago. He was standing by the reception desk talking with a group of employees. I noticed him before he noticed me. His back was turned, and for a moment I wondered if he would even recognize me. After all, I had been just another cog in the machine. But I wasn't just another cog anymore. I approached the reception desk and caught the eye of the receptionist, a young woman who had been working there for as long as I could remember. Her face flickered with recognition, but she didn't say anything. It was as if the building itself held its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then I saw Dave turn around. His eyes met mine. At first there was confusion. He looked at me with a blank stare, trying to place me. I stood there calm as ever, watching him try to make sense of who I was now. It didn't take long before the recognition hit him. His eyes widened, and the color drained from his face as he took a slow step backward. For a moment we just stood there, locked in an uncomfortable silence. I wasn't going to say anything first. I wasn't going to gloat. I didn't need to. The power of the situation was already clear. Finally he stammered, "John, what are you doing here?" I didn't answer him right away. Instead I handed him the envelope, the lease agreement, the one that would seal everything. "Here," I said simply. "Rent from May 1st. Payment is strictly on schedule." Dave's hands shook as he took the document from me, his eyes darting back and forth between the paper and my face. I could see the fear in his eyes. This wasn't how he expected things to unfold. He had probably thought I would simply fade into the background, another casualty of a changing world. But I had been paying attention, every little detail of the business, every movement behind closed doors, and now I held the power. I nodded once, my voice calm and unwavering. "Thank you for your service." I watched him pale as the weight of the words settled in. There was no fight left in him. He was the one who had fired me, who had looked at me as expendable, and now he was the one who would be forced to answer to me. "John," he said again, this time with a hint of desperation in his voice, I didn't know." I didn't give him a chance to finish. There was no need to. Instead, I turned and walked away, heading toward the back of the building. Behind me, I could feel the stares of the employees, the silence that followed my every step. I didn't need to hear any more apologies. I didn't need his explanation. All that mattered was that I was the one in control now. The lease agreement was just the first step. The next would be enforcing it. I knew the game well enough to know that people would push the limits, try to test my resolve. But I wasn't like before. I wasn't the technician who kept quiet in the shadows, doing what he was told. Now I was the one making the rules. And they would learn soon enough that the price of defying me would be steep. I didn't need to go back to that office. I didn't need to show up and rub it in their faces. No, that would be too easy. Instead, I would let the building do the talking for me. I would make sure the rent was paid, that every deadline was met, and if there was the slightest misstep, they would feel the consequences. I wasn't going to show them any mercy. They had shown me none. By the end of the week, I would have everything in place. The building would be mine, and they would be on my terms. No more false promises, no more empty words. Just the cold reality of business. Where power wasn't given, it was taken. And now I was the one holding the keys. The first month of ownership passed in a blur, a strange combination of steady business transactions and subtle satisfaction. The tenants paid their rent, as expected, and everything seemed to run as it had before, but with one significant difference. I was the one pulling the strings now. Mark, my business partner, was a useful asset, handling the day-to-day operations, the things I had no interest in managing, but I kept my focus on the bigger picture, on the power dynamics. There was one part of me that still felt the sting of the dismissal, and in a strange way, that kept me grounded. It gave me the clarity I needed to remain unemotional, calculating. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I was beyond that now. But I wasn't about to let anyone forget what had happened. I made sure everything was running smoothly, but I also made sure to keep a close eye on the employees. I didn't want them to think I was going to let anything slide. I had no intention of being a passive landlord, just collecting rent every month and fading into the background. I wasn't just a business owner. I was the man who had been fired, humiliated, and cast aside. I wanted them to remember that. It was a Friday when the first misstep occurred. It was a small one, nothing that should have bothered me. One of the tenants, a small accounting firm on the second floor, had missed their payment deadline by 3 days. They called the office offering some excuse about a delay in their funds. I could have let it slide, but I didn't. I wasn't angry. I didn't raise my voice. But I added a fine to their payment, a late fee stipulated in the lease agreement. I didn't care that it was a minor infraction. I wanted to send a message. I told Mark to send them an email, politely reminding them of the terms of the lease. I knew the fine would irritate them, but it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the principle. The lease was clear, and the longer I kept everything strictly by the book, the clearer it would be that there was no room for negotiation. The following Monday, the accounting firm's representative came to the building to discuss the fine. She had a look of frustration, but she didn't dare raise her voice. I met her at the door and, without hesitation, handed her the updated invoice, with the fine clearly outlined. She tried to argue, but I simply nodded, repeating that the terms were clear and the payment was due. She was uncomfortable, of course, but she didn't press it any further. She paid the rent, including the fine, and left. The building settled into a new rhythm after that. The tenants seemed to understand that I wasn't the same person they had known before. I wasn't the soft-spoken maintenance guy anymore. I wasn't the one who let things slide because it was easier. I had become a person of authority, someone whose rules were to be followed, or else. Each month, the rent was paid promptly. The tenants didn't try to push their luck, didn't test my patience. They were all too aware that I was watching, that I was meticulous, and that there would be no room for mistakes. They respected the lease, and they respected me. I began to visit the building more frequently, checking in, walking through the halls, making sure everything was in order. I wanted them to see me, to feel my presence. I wasn't an absentee landlord. I didn't sit in my office far away, counting profits. I was there, and they knew it. Then there was Dave, the senior manager who had fired me, the man who had looked at me and decided I wasn't worth keeping around. He had not yet fully come to terms with the fact that I owned the building. At first, he tried to pretend like everything was normal, as if nothing had changed, but it had. I knew it, and I could see that he did too. I made sure to stop by his office regularly, not out of necessity, but because I wanted him to know that I could. Every time I entered the building, I would casually make my way past his office. I never entered unless it was necessary, but I'd always make sure to wave or nod in his direction. The first time I caught him off guard, he had been on a call. I waited until he finished and then walked into his office. He looked up at me, his face flushing with the realization of who was standing in front of him. "John," he said, his voice strained, trying to mask the discomfort. "What brings you by?" I didn't respond right away. I just stood there looking at him, letting the silence stretch. Finally, I spoke. I was just checking on the building, Dave. You know how it is. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Right, of course, you know. It's been a strange few months. I didn't give him an answer. There was no need for more words. Instead, I simply nodded and turned to leave. He didn't say anything else, and I didn't need him to. As time went on, I began to feel the power of my position settling in. I wasn't working for anyone anymore. I didn't need anyone's approval or permission. I was in charge. The tenants, the employees, even Dave, they all knew it. And it was this calm sense of control that I carried with me every day. I wasn't angry anymore. I had no need for anger. I had what I wanted, and I had done it on my terms. There were no more office folders, no more dismissal letters. There was only the building, and I was its owner. Fridays have always been a routine for me. Even now, with everything changed, I still wake up early. The alarm rings at 6 a.m., and I slip out of bed. My movements mechanical, automatic. There's something about the consistency of it that soothes me. It's no longer the rush of getting ready to leave for work, but the calm of knowing there's nothing to rush to anymore. I brew my coffee, sit by the window and look out at the city. The same city I've worked in for so long. I watch the workers heading to their offices, the early risers hurrying to catch their buses, their trains. It's a familiar scene, the kind I used to rush past without ever truly seeing. Now I see everything. I sit in that chair, my coffee in hand, with the same silence that used to hang over my mornings. Only now it feels different. It's not the silence of waiting for a machine to turn on or the hum of factory floors. No, this silence is the quiet of ownership, the kind that no one can take from you. I've earned it. My office now looks out over the building I once walked through like a ghost. But now, when I walk its halls, I walk with purpose. I'm no longer a cog in the machine. I'm the man who controls it. I don't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. I've already done what I needed to. I'm not some old man wandering aimlessly through life. I've come to realize something. All those years of hard work, the dedication, the patience, they weren't a mistake. They were the foundation for this moment. It wasn't a simple revenge nor a dramatic confrontation. It was a precise, deliberate maneuver, and it worked. They might think they got rid of me, that I was nothing more than a disposable tool. They could have their new hires, their shiny new team, but they'll never understand what it took to get here. I think back to that day in the office when I was handed that "thank you for your service" folder, the severance pay, the dismissal. I could have reacted differently. I could have raged, shouted, maybe even begged them to reconsider. But I didn't. I kept my calm, kept my focus. I knew what I had to do, and I did it. Now as I sit there, my coffee warming my hands, I feel a calm sense of superiority. Not because I've destroyed anyone, but because I've come full circle. When I first started here, I was just another worker, another face in the crowd. But they made the mistake of thinking I was just like the others, replaceable, disposable. But they didn't realize that behind every action, every move I made, was a quiet resolve, a plan. I see Dave from time to time, of course. He's still here, still managing the same office, sitting at the same desk, trying to carry on as if nothing has changed. But it's different now. I walk past his office and see the tight smile on his face, the forced greetings. It's a game for him, one he hasn't fully come to terms with yet. I'm not going to make him suffer, though. There's no need for that. He already knows. The tenants pay their rent on time, just as I've required. They smile more tightly when they see me. Some offer pleasantries, but it's all business now. I am the owner, the one who determines whether they stay or go, and they know that. There's no room for any misunderstanding. I make sure everything runs smoothly, but I also make sure they remember who's in charge. Sometimes I'll see Mark around the building too. He's become more of a partner than a business associate. He handles the day-to-day, the operational stuff, the nitty-gritty. I still oversee the big picture. He doesn't need to be told anything more than what's required. I don't have to explain myself to him. He knows his place, and I know mine. I look at the tenants, the ones who signed their leases under the old regime, and I wonder if they ever think about the man who used to work here. The one they walked past, the one who was dismissed without a second thought. Do they realize that he's now the one they have to answer to? It's strange. There's a part of me that feels almost nothing. It's not a feeling of triumph or vengeance. It's something deeper. It's the feeling of having controlled the outcome, of having played the long game and won. And so, I continue my Fridays. I sit by the window, sip my coffee, and watch the world move. The same world that once looked at me as disposable now looks at me as the one in charge. I was never angry. I never sought to tear them down. I simply wanted them to see the value I had always known was there. They didn't want me, so I took what they had. I turned their rejection into my triumph. Now it's not the factory that holds my attention, not the hum of machines or the grind of daily labor. It's my building, my lease, my terms. And when I leave my office, I leave with purpose, not as someone who was pushed aside, but as the one who controls it all. I'm not just a man who once worked here. I'm the man who owns it now.